Just to say, I was going to call this, the title of this presentation, Justice in an Unjust Society, because I think, it captures something about the situation of travellers in Ireland. However, I thought we'll just go with the title I have. As was said, I'm Thomas McCann. I run the Traveller Council Service and I've been involved in travellers' rights for many years. So I have, and in 2008 we launched the Traveller Counselling Service, which was really to kind of develop culturally appropriate counselling and psychotherapy for travellers, because the mental health crisis in the traveller community was growing, and we needed an alternative to the kind of a medical model to support people around mental health. And we have a very committed group of counsellors and psychotherapists, and develop partnerships in local areas with the traveller community. And we're also, at the minute, have a counsellor in Docus 1 day a week, and now in Mountjoy as well, one afternoon a week, with the support of the present authorities. As I said, I'll just see next. Okay. The need to address the wider social and economic conditions. That's really kind of the present. And this is not, and I might say this in the end of this is not an excuse for people to break the law, but it's really to present the conditions that are more likely to lead to somebody ending up in prison. So it is. Like any of us in this room, for instance, in the similar conditions, could end in prison. So it's to give that kind of broader analysis around the conditions that travellers are in. Now, this writing is very small, so for some people in the room, have a lot of knowledge about travellers. Other people don't. So I'm not assuming anything in terms of coming to this presentation. Travellers are an ethnic minority who comprise, as was said earlier on, 0.6% of the population. About 30,000 approximately. That was in the census 2011, which was, as was said a long time ago, I think Martin might have said it, is less than half the size of Croke Park on an All-Ireland final day, which tells you that this gives you some kind of picture of the size of the community. The travel community have a long history with its own traditions, language, practical skills, culture, arts, music. Paddy Keenan will be here later on, who's a cousin of mine. Nomadism has been central to that, and the keeping of horses, and strong values around families and extended family. The current situation of travellers is a difficult one. Has been for a very long time, but it's getting more and more difficult. With travellers' traditional way of life, nomadism and distinctive economy affected by rapid economic and social change. And there's other bits, but I only have a certain length of time. So as a community, travellers have experienced extreme levels of racism, discrimination and social exclusion. As a survey commissioned by Citizen Traveller, which I was involved in 2000, demonstrates, 36% of Irish people would avoid travellers. 97% would not accept travellers as members of their family, although I'm married to a settled woman. 80% would not accept a traveller as a friend, and 44% of travellers 44% would not want travellers to be members of their community. That gives you an example. That's a snapshot of settled attitudes in 2000 during the Citizen Traveller campaign, which was carried out by Behaviour and Attitudes, an independent market research company. A more recent survey carried out by the Community Foundation of Ireland, July of this year, that was just launched. 77% of travellers have experienced discrimination in the last year. 43% indicated they have encountered discrimination while accessing employment. 40% of travellers indicate that they or their children have been bullied at school due to their identity. 60% of the community indicate that they are not working, and it's even higher than that. The figure for unemployment in the travel community is about 82%, between 82 and 84%, which is enormous when you look at unemployment. The average age for finishing school among travellers is 15 years old. Again, this research was carried out in partnership with travellers by Behaviour and Attitudes. Again, that's available on Community Foundation website. So it'd be interesting for people to look at that, because actually some things has got worse. Attitudes has hardened. People has taken a more entrenched position between 2000 and now. So it's just to give people an idea of that. In relation to travellers in prison, the Irish Penal Reform Trust, as was stated earlier on, identified that traveller men are 11 times more likely than other men to be in prison, while traveller women is 22 times, the risk is 22 times higher than in the settled community. So there's a huge disproportionate risk of travellers ending up in the prison system. As the Minister said earlier on, this is not unique to travellers. This is similar circumstances exist with other minority groups in other countries. So there's a similarity between exclusion, and I'll go into that a little bit, and ending up in prison. As has been shown by numerous reports, not just the reports I mentioned, huge number of reports throughout the years, that travellers are one of the most disadvantaged and marginalised groups in Irish society, if not the most. As a community, travellers fare badly, and every indicator, I'm sure some people in the room has heard that again and again. Unemployment, poverty, social exclusion, health status, infant mortality rate, life expectancy, illiteracy, formal education and training levels. It's right across the board. And in terms of university, I'm doing a PhD. I mean, there's about 5 travellers, I think, at the minute. Like, less than 1% of travellers go on to university in the travel community, you know. So that's the rate of disadvantage. And somebody was saying, I don't know, was it on an interview recently, that the rate of education kind of mirrors the rate of people ending up in prison. So you see a correlation between the lack of education and people generally, if you look at that. I mean, I think John Lonergan, when he was the Governor of Mountjoy, spoke on this issue many times in public. The background has implications, has huge implications for the overrepresentation of travellers in prison, both men and women, and it's important to emphasise that. The racism, exclusion and oppression that have and continue to be experienced, that travellers continue to experience, has been going on for generations. And it is from the time one is born into the community. So it's there already. When you're born into the community, it's not something that starts to happen. It's like it's already there, and it's there for generations. So this has a historical root. The exclusion and the racism that travellers face in Ireland has a historical root that goes way back. Again, you know, as more travellers become involved in the process of looking at our own history, that hopefully will come more to the fore, because usually it has people been from outside of the committee, outside of the community, and has been usually from an ethnocentric perspective a lot of the time that studies has been carried out. Alongside this was the state's denial of traveller ethnicity, you know, and as was said earlier on, the Minister was kind of there on the committee and recommended that. However, that was, you know, denied for such a long time. Traveller history, culture, identity was denied by the state, and was only recently, in the last while, kind of acknowledged by the state. The dominant discourse was that travellers were failed settled people who were a problem and needed to be rehabilitated and assimilated into the majority community, as stated in the 1963 Report on Itinerancy by Charles J. Haughey. And that set the scene for the mindset in Ireland that we find ourselves today in the present situation today, both in terms of attitude, and I mean, I just put in that reference. I mean, it's a well-known reference. You know, I'll just read it out. These terms of reference are comprehensive. This was to the introduction to the Report on Itinerancy, 1963, and they acknowledge the fact that there can be no final solution to the problem created by itinerants until they are absorbed into the general community. That was the drive that was institutionalised in Irish society by the 1963 report, and that set the mindset. That discourse shaped the attitudes, the policy and the practice towards the travel community for the last 5 decades, and we're dealing with the consequences of that now. The impact of this has been detrimental on a number of levels. On members of the travel community themselves, in terms of internalising these messages, the denial that what was happening to travellers was racism, the denial of recognition of traveller ethnicity and culture, and that it was a valid culture, that in some way it wasn't valid, this culture wasn't valid, the justification for the continued denial of basic human rights, including cultural rights such as nomadism, and indeed, like if we look at language, you know, we talked about language, maybe, and music, you know, resourcing that, and kind of, I mean, look at the Irish language, it nearly died out only for people began to focus on it. Like every languages die out, minority languages die out all the time across the world, unless they're resourced, unless they're kind of taken on board, and that's what's happening to the traveller community. The poor relations between the traveller and the settled community, this discourse is part of kind of keeping that divide in place, and a lack of culturally appropriate services. Sure, what's the need for culturally appropriate services? Really, if the traveller culture is not seen as a valid culture, we don't need culturally appropriate services if that's not the case. So policy, it shapes policy. The impact of this, and this is the internalised bit on members of the traveller community, as travellers, we have internalised a lot of these messages, which result in living in a context. You actually, everyone, I mean, it's how we learn. This is a psychological fact. It's how we learn in terms of education and anything. As children, and we grow up, we internalise, so we do. And this is experienced both at an individual level, but also at a community level, where members of the group believe there's something wrong with us, and that it is our fault, and we are somehow responsible for being treated in this way. So you believe that, that it's our own fault for being in this way. This is huge, also has a huge impact on self-esteem, on the sense of self, just who we are as people, as a culture, on our self-esteem, self-confidence, in terms of going forward, that we believe that we're not, people can believe that they're not good enough. I mean, I had it myself. I did a master's in Trinity, and I remember when I went in thinking, I shouldn't be in here. Really, is this where I should be? Many travellers have that experience, because of that. That really kind of, should we be here at all? And that's really, that's the feeling for a lot of travellers, and that's a struggle. That's that internalised bit. But it can also lead on to more like anxiety, depression, and situations where travellers hide their identity. And have an internalised shame, but hide their identity as well in terms of travellers, and that's an internal struggle. If you're hiding your identity, that's an internal struggle that's going on. So it is. It might on the outside look fine, and people might look fine and look like they're getting on. Internally, there's an internal struggle going on in that hiding of identity. It's an identity crisis, and that has terrible consequences. I mean, terrible psychological consequences. It also creates an expectation that in members of the travel community that we're going to be treated badly, and we're not going to get a fair deal. So it sets up an expectation. Because it's happened so many times, it sets up an expectation that that's what's going to happen. Mental health, as I said, we're in a crisis in terms of mental health in the travel community at the minute. Earlier on we said 7 times higher suicide. Self-harm, we haven't even touched on self-harm. There's very few figures in terms of self-harm in the community. But we know by the level of suicide, and we know by other indicators, that the level of self-harm is multiples of that. And so there's a huge need for focus on because if you're looking at preventing suicide, you have to look at what the context is for that. For members, for travellers, numbers of travellers on prescribed medication for anxiety much higher than the settled community. Some reports has been done on this. The lack of take up by travellers until they're in crisis in the services and that came back from the mental health services. And I haven't got it in there. The overrepresentation of travellers in psychiatric units is another issue. Like 15%, they reckon about 15% of the travellers in the Central Mental Hospital in Dundrum are travellers, which is a huge overrepresentation, and that came back from the people who's working in the services. That's, it's anecdotal again. This is where the ethnic identifier comes in. And an increasing use of Class A drugs. I mean, there's a use of drugs across the board in the travel community. Class A drugs, such as cocaine and heroin, is really on the increase. And it's kind of, a lot of travellers now are affected by these. I didn't add homelessness. I thought maybe I had enough in there to be getting on with. But anyway, negative stereotypes. Just to say something about negative stereotypes. Negative stereotypes contribute to keeping this discourse and situation in place, and reinforced by the media. I should have said some sections of the media, not all the media, but some sections of the media. Negative stories in the newspapers, on the TV, for example, recent programmes, that reinforce them negative stereotypes of travellers. And when I say negative stereotypes, it doesn't mean that people aren't doing stuff, but it means that the whole community is labelled. That's a stereotype. It doesn't allow for diversity in the community. So it doesn't. It doesn't say this individual did this. It's the whole community, and that's a stereotype, and that's what keeps this discourse in place. by government policies. I mean, like, if you look at the anti-trespass legislation, where nomadism is criminalised, although this legislation was supposed to impact on anyone parking illegally, not the case. It has primarily impacted on travellers, where travellers, their caravans has been taken and impounded, with families sometimes left standing on the side of the road, where I was involved in trying to get a hotel or a place for that family to stay. In one particular instance, we even rang the Red Cross in the county to see could we get accommodation. There was a family of 10, their caravan had been taken, we couldn't get accommodation for them. They ended up sleeping in vans and cars for a few nights until they got the caravans back. And that has happened. And there's a real need to kind of repeal that law, because being able to move was also a part of kind of, the Minister talked about kind of conflict and feuding. It was a way of people kind of being able to move on from something when things was going wrong. They were able to move. Now that's not possible in Ireland. But also in terms of other state agencies and services. The HSE, the Gardaí. And again, it'd be worth looking at some of these reports. This is not just something I'm saying. I mean, this is something that's also there in the research as well. By judges. I mean, the recent comments by judges, towards travellers. If you're up in court and you hear a judge making a comment about your community, you really feel that I'm not going to get a fair shake, before the judgment is passed. And that's happened, and that's happened publicly. Yet there was no outcry about what judges say about travellers. Although, we try to push that issue. They're supposed to be independent, but they have a big impact in terms of reinforcing certain stereotypes, but also the number of people going to prison. The gap between the services and the travellers. We know in Ireland that there's a huge gap. We know, from both from the services and from the community, and we know this, so we do. And the impact of this again, the All Ireland Traveller Health Study, another piece of research that was carried out, that identified a whole range of issues. It's a lot of still sitting on the shelf. 2010, there was a huge number of travellers involved in this across the board. And then, as I said, the research has been published recently by the Community Foundation of Ireland. There are a number of factors that keeps this gap in place. Some of them, looking at it, the lack of cultural competence among service providers. This is not just for travellers. This is across the board in terms of Irish society. We have a very diverse society. If you just look beyond travellers for a second, I think about 14% of the population is of non-Irish origin. Yet we don't look at the type of services we're providing in terms of culturally inclusive services. And going down that road, this idea that one size fits all doesn't work. Because you have different norms, different values, different traditions in different communities, and to be understood as well. Because one of the things when people come to us, travellers come to us, who's been in other services and other council, we say, why did you leave? Because the councillor that they went into didn't understand the community. So somebody felt that they had to explain everything about the community before they could talk about the problem. So they didn't feel understood. The discrimination in the services, and again, that's there. As I said, internalised oppression, the invisibility of travellers in the system in terms of a lack of an ethnic identifier. How can you plan a service if you can't count the people? And it's not about individuals. It's not about individual information. It's known the use of service by a community and what they're coming with and the outcomes for that community. Poor relationships between service providers and the traveller community. We need change. We need change across the board. And if we're going to change the picture and break the cycle of intergenerational poverty, exclusion and oppression, we need to develop real partnerships, between the traveller community, service providers and policymakers based on equality and respect. Because we can have these partnerships and we can have participation, but it doesn't mean they're equal, and it doesn't mean that it brings change. That needs to change. They need to be based on equality and respect. We can't undo history, the history of division and oppression. However, we can begin to build positive relationships, between, as is happening here, between service providers and indeed the wider society. But as I said, some of these issues need to be addressed, the other issues that were named. We need to address the inequality, poor living circumstances, unemployment, I think, is a key one as well, And if you keep restricting people's way of making a living, whether it's through markets legislation and the bar gets higher and higher, or through the horses legislation where the bar gets higher and higher and people can't meet it, you restrict more and more people's capacity to do stuff. And at the same time, the wider labour market excludes travellers, and they know that they're going to be discriminated in that, and it's been shown again and again. You end up in a situation where you have poverty, and extreme poverty in some cases. We need to have services which are culturally appropriate and inclusive, including accommodation. Traveller culture needs to be promoted and respected, as was said earlier on, to begin to rebuild the self-esteem, self-confidence and self-respect that has been really, and again I say this, it's not an excuse for people breaking the law, but people really need to understand the conditions that people live in. That young travellers and older travellers are living in, men and women across the country right now. I could give you names of sites where people are living on. That's nearly 90%, 95% of the people on the site are unemployed. There's really no opportunities. That's the circumstances, and sometimes we're a little bit removed from that. In conclusion, the programmes and projects that have been developed to address some of the issues of travellers in prison are innovative. They're really innovative. They're imaginative, and already they are beginning to show some results, even though they're still at a very early stage. But they really are. And this work needs to continue. There is buy-in from the key stakeholders, and I have to say that that's from the prison services, from the traveller prisoners. There's huge buy-in from the traveller prisoners and from the traveller groups. So them is the key people in that. And really, however, unless the wider economic and social conditions that are impacting on the traveller community are addressed, as I said, all the things, unemployment, educational disadvantage, poor health, I don't want to go over them, overcrowded accommodation, travellers will continue to be overrepresented in the prison system. And my fear is that it's actually going to get worse unless they're addressed. And we can, so we need to change the discourse. We need to change the conditions that travellers have to endure. Otherwise, we'll be just addressing the symptoms rather than addressing some of the causal factors that lead to the overrepresentation of travellers in the first place. I'd like to thank everybody very much. I hope it didn't depress you too much. As I said, the programmes that is going on are really innovative. They're really good. And I'm 100%, and the Travel Council Service is committed to developing them programmes. But we need to look at these wider issues as well if we're really going to make progress. Thank you very much.